My guest tonight started off doing ring announcing in the Midwest, which led to gigs hosting and doing play-by-play for the Urban Wrestling Alliance and the English releases for FMW. He's still broadcasting today in radio, where he recently hit 12 years with KWVE in California. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the Pro Wrestling Potluck, Straight Up John Watanabe!
Woo! Yeah!
How's it going, John? Thanks for doing the show.
Well, thank you, Mr. Green, for having me. I thank God for everything. I thank my Lord and Savior Jesus Christ for his free gift of eternal life and salvation in him. And I'm thankful that we've been protected from the rain here in Southern California. It's funny, when you interviewed my friend and UWA colleague Marcus Ham recently on your show, it was raining in Southern California.
It was.
And now today it is still raining in Southern California. And my wife, April, she said when she drove on her way from work to home, along with the rain, it was also hailing.
Oh, my God.
Yeah, and also in the Southern California mountains, we've been having snowfall as low as 1,500 feet. So it's a reminder that according to the calendar, it is winter. But, you know, through it all, we do need the rain, the moisture, because we have a drought here in Southern California. So we really need it.
Good.
Maybe be careful in it, though. But at least here in California recently, we have not had any earthquakes, aka shades of the G-Shock by Flatline in the UWA.
Yes, we are talking. Flatline is one of the favorites of my audience. So you saw this in the Marcus Ham interview, but we watched a ton of Urban Wrestling Alliance on this show. We watched everything that was available on YouTube, and Flatline is a favorite of the show. So let's just get right into it. Who were your favorites when you were growing up? Because you grew up a wrestling fan.
Yes, I did, and I think that makes a difference if you want to become a pro wrestling announcer. Because
Absolutely.
Over the years, I've seen, without naming names, I've seen a few wrestling announcers who may be broadcasters with broadcasting experience, which thank God I have too, but you could just tell they're not wrestling fans. And I think a lot of the diehard wrestling fans can see right through that. So
Absolutely.
I'm thankful that I grew up as a wrestling fan, just as you have. And by the way, you said you watched the UWA on the UPN TV network in New Orleans, Louisiana.
Yes.
Is that correct? Yeah, well, I thank God that we had fans there in the Junkyard Dog's old yard in New Orleans.
Yes.
So praise God for that.
And I got to tell you, one of my favorite things on these Urban Wrestling Alliance matches is when you bring out the knowledge of the past while, you know, we're watching Flatline or the Black Legion or whatever, and I love that.
Well, yeah, I remember when I announced for Flatline's matches, I said Shades of Bobo Brazil, and you know that's kind of what he looked like, this big, intimidating-looking guy who really finished people off effectively with his G-Shock. With Bobo, it was the headbutt, the Coco butt. With the Flatline, it was the G-Shock clothesline. But anyway, I grew up watching two regional promotions in the Midwest, Vern Gagne's American Wrestling Association and Dick the Bruiser's World Wrestling Association, based out of Indiana. And Gagne was based out of Minnesota. And I grew up in Illinois. So when I grew up, we had the best of both worlds.
Yeah, good spot.
Yeah, and Gagne and Bruiser together promoted cards together at the famous International Amphitheater in Chicago, and I saw many matches there. The amphitheater is a famous venue where they've had political conventions, major concerts, and other events. And at one time, wrestling held the attendance record at the International Amphitheater for a match pitting AWA World Champion Vern Gagne versus the master of the Heart Punch, Ox Baker.
Oh yeah, I love Ox.
Yeah, and at the time, Ox Baker was managed by my good friend, Handsome Johnny Starr. Most recently, he's been known as Pastor John Davis in Noblesville, Indiana. So I grew up watching the AWA and WWA in Chicago. And I also, while working in broadcasting at different radio stations, I interviewed different wrestlers on the air. So I got to know the wrestlers in that way. And off the top, when I interviewed wrestlers early in my radio career, my favorite interviews were Ox Baker. I had him live in the studio.
Awesome.
And also and also Kurt Hennig back when he was the AWA World Champion, and a guy known then as Paul E. Dangerously.
Oh, wow.
Who we now know as Paul Heyman.
Yeah.
Paul,
he's probably a great guest.
Yeah, and when you mention my name to him nowadays, he'll say all sorts of good things about me, even though he always maintained kayfabe and treated me like when he was on the air, but really super guy behind the scenes. And also, early in my broadcasting career, I did ring announcing at local house shows. In fact, whenever the National Wrestling Alliance put on cards at the Hammond Civic Center in Hammond, Indiana, which was really a part of the Chicago metro area, National Wrestling Alliance promoter Gary Juster would call me up and ask me, do you want to do ring announcing here? And I would say yes. So, and the funny thing is, I would interview some of his wrestlers whenever the NWA came to the area. And then one day, Gary Juster out of the blue asked me, have you ever done ring announcing? And I go, no. And he said, but you've seen it thousands of times. I go, oh yeah. And he knew I would be a good choice because sadly, some of the ring announcers who did local house show ring announcing knew nothing about wrestling at all, where they would mispronounce the wrestlers' names, where they would introduce a guy and point at the wrong wrestler.
So they're just doing a job. They don't even care.
Exactly. And Gary Juster knew all that, but Gary knew that I knew wrestling. So that's why I, thank God, successfully did ring announcing for his wrestling shows. And it's always an honor when the boys or the people involved in wrestling compliment me on my wrestling. In fact, on my wrestling knowledge and wrestling ring announcing. I remember my first time ring announcing at the Hammond Civic Center. The referee was Drew Tossell, who was a preliminary wrestler for Vern Gagne's AWA. And after a while, after I did some ring announcing, Drew Tossell said to me, you're doing a good job, Mr. Announcer, good job. So that really encouraged me to continue on working in the wrestling business.
I know that feeling. I've actually done some ring announcing myself recently for House of Glory up here, the Amazing Reds company. I trained there for a little bit, and I do ring announcing for their student shows. And I love it. I love it because I did stand up for 10 years, so I'm used to yelling at audiences.
That's a good way of handling hecklers and audiences, stand-up comedy training. And by the way, related to that, I have training in improvisation, doing improv on stage, which really helps you to think on your feet, including in audition situations. I was trained in improv by the late, great Avery Schreiber, a great comedian. Oh, yeah. He was famous he was a part of a comedy team, Burns and Schreiber. Their catchphrase going back and forth was, yeah, huh, yeah, huh, yeah, huh, yeah, huh. And also Avery Schreiber would do Doritos TV commercials, crunch. And he was famous for Doritos TV commercials during the 70s and 80s. And through those commercials, he put his kids through college. So that was a great gig for him.
Absolutely.
But anyway, again, improv, it's a great way to think on your feet when it comes to all sorts of performing, including play-by-play announcing.
Well, you mentioned auditioning. So you auditioned to get the role in FMW, right? And how did that work out?
Yes, I auditioned for both of these national gigs that you've been talking about. I auditioned for Tokyo Pop's English language presentation of FMW, Frontier Martial Arts Wrestling, at the Tokyo Pop headquarters in the well-known 5900 building on Wilshire Boulevard in Los Angeles. And I could tell right off the bat, those guys who auditioned me, they knew that I knew wrestling. They auditioned lots of actors. I sat in the waiting room listening to them. They scream and yelled, acting what they thought a stereotypical wrestling announcer should sound like. But I could tell they had no knowledge of wrestling. And when it came to the FMW wrestling announcing gig, play-by-play and on-camera hosting, which I eventually got, you asked Marcus Ham in your interview with him, were there any well-known names to audition when he first got into UWA?
Yes.
Well, I could tell you this when it came to FMW. I didn't see everybody who auditioned, okay, maybe there were more, but there were at least two names well-known within the wrestling business who auditioned for the announcing gig that I got. One of them I will not name because he's a guy who had tremendous wrestling knowledge, who I have the greatest respect for, so I won't mention who he is. But the other guy, when he auditioned, it was made public. So I might as well mention who that is. Yeah, please. Another guy who auditioned for my FMW wrestling announcing gig was the Hollywood actor known as Tiny Lister, who became
Debo from Friday.
Yeah, and who became known in a short time in wrestling as Zeus.
Yeah.
In the WWF, he went against Hulk Hogan
Yeah.
in the movie No Holds Barred.
Wow.
And he wrestled 1 or 2 pay-per-view events for the WWF. And it's so funny. I know this because when I auditioned in the audition room for FMW at the Tokyo Pop headquarters, I saw Tiny Lister's 8x10 headshot on the floor. So I know he was there. And then later on, when Dan the Mouth Lavansky and I did commentating, Daisuke Kanochi, one of our production assistants from Tokyo Pop, confirmed me that yes, Tiny Lister, aka Zeus, did audition for the gig, and Dan Lavansky laughed and laughed. He said, "Do you have footage of his audition? I'd like to see it. That would make me laugh." And I always tell people, when it comes to me getting the FMW announcing gig, I joke to people, Hulk Hogan and I have something in common. We both scored victories over Zeus.
Oh, I love that. So how familiar with you, or how familiar with FMW were you when going into the audition? Did you watch any of that stuff?
Not as much as other types of wrestling, but at least I had a handle of what wrestling was all about.
Yeah.
It came to wrestling moves and wrestling psychology, which really never changed, no matter what league you call action for. But when it came to FMW wrestling, I followed some of the Japanese promotions to an extent, but not as much as some others. But just like with any gig, you do your homework as you go along. And yeah, Dan Lavansky and I, we did our research. And also I got plenty of insights from some of the FMW wrestlers, including none other than Hayabusa.
The great R.I.P.
The great, yes, the great AJ Izaki, aka Hayabusa. In fact, my best memory of him was when I did ring announcing for Tokyo Pop at the Los Angeles Convention Center in downtown Los Angeles, where the E3 convention took place.
Yep,
one year.
I was gonna ask you about that. Now, what was that experience like?
What an experience. Yeah, they had, all these different booths going on, and also the ECW wrestlers were there as well. They had a booth. They were promoting a video game of theirs.
Oh yeah.
And I remember Tommy Dreamer asked me, "What, does FMW have a video game too?" I said, "Oh no, we're promoting our videotapes coming up, presenting the English language version of FMW, which had not come out yet." And that's one thing that I'm so proud of when it comes to FMW presented by Tokyo Pop. Some fans, including some independent wrestlers, have said that I was a part of their first exposure to Japanese pro wrestling in North America.
That's
and for
incredible.
That, I'm very proud of that.
That's awesome. Yeah.
Yeah. So at the Los Angeles Convention Center in downtown Los Angeles, they had a wrestling ring set up, and I was there wearing a suit, doing ring announcing, and I was promoting Tokyo Pop heavily, their anime products, their various books they had. And I also mentioned that coming soon, the English language presentation of Tokyo Pop's FMW Frontier Martial Arts Wrestling. And then during that day, the FMW wrestlers, including Hayabusa, Fuyuki, and others, they came out and wrestled a series of matches 3 times that day. And in between matches, Hayabusa graciously gave me tips, insights into what was going on in FMW, some of the characters, some of the angles going on. And that really gave me some insights when I eventually called the moves and the storylines for FMW.
Now, you mentioned the storylines. I know that early on they had people make up storylines for you guys to put out there. Now, what was that like when did they not think that US fans would know or care? They thought we needed weird stories?
I think certain people who made decisions at the time underestimated the intelligence of wrestling fans. With the internet, with the internet, you could search a lot of stuff. We're back in the territory days during the 1960s, 70s, and 80s. You didn't have the internet. You can do immediate searches on what was really going on behind the scenes in wrestling. You could maybe get away with it back then, but not in today's modern wrestling. And there's always been a certain amount of fictional storylines, fictional characters in wrestling to an extent, but I think the writers that they hired from Hollywood really went overboard. We were forced to say via scripts reading word for word that Terry Funk, the great wrestling legend Terry Funk, was a fighter pilot and parachute artist from New Jersey. I mean, I mean, you don't want to insult the real wrestling fans
Yeah.
who you're trying to cater to.
Well, I'm glad they came to their senses and just kind of let you guys do your job and tell the people who the wrestlers are and what the real storylines are. We watched some FMW last week. We watched some FMW that you were commentating, and you were calling Horace Boulder, Horace Hogan, CPA the whole time.
That was not my idea. That was not my idea. They hired 3 Hollywood script writers, and one of them was the director at the time. Yeah, and they made up all these nonsensical storylines that Horace Boulder, a real wrestler, was an accountant named CPA. You don't have to take fictional characterizations to that extreme, to the point where you insult the intelligence of the wrestling fans. So I respect these Hollywood scriptwriters because they had fine credits when it came to mainstream Hollywood entertainment, doing TV commercials, Hollywood films. But when it came to wrestling or wrestling knowledge or how wrestling fans thought, they really did a lot of underestimate. They really underestimated things. And as you know, my first color commentator was Eric Geller, who was a nice guy, a nice, funny guy behind the scenes, but his wrestling knowledge was limited. He was primarily a stand-up comic.
That just doesn't work.
No, and his wrestling knowledge was limited to National Wrestling Alliance St. Louis Wrestling back in the day, which had a lot of wrestlers, but that was his only knowledge of wrestling, really. And I'm thankful, nothing against Eric Geller, but I'm thankful that they brought on Dan the Mouth Lavransky instead from Live Audio Wrestling to be my color commentator, because obviously he had a lot of wrestling knowledge. He was a wrestling fan growing up too. And this is what I was told behind the scenes. If I did not get the gig as the FMW on-camera host and play-by-play announcer, they were going to put Eric Geller in my spot as the lead announcer doing play-by-play, and along with him, hire a girl or female to be his color commentary.
Oh, wow.
And Dan Lavransky laughed and said, "Oh, that would have been a disaster." And I think, well, I won't say anything further, but I'm glad that Tokyo Pop made the right decision to have Dan Lavransky and me do non-scripted color commentary and play-by-play, utilizing our real wrestling knowledge, making real wrestling references that did not insult the wrestling fans' intelligence, and that really told the real storylines and the real biographies of these great FMW wrestlers.
Absolutely. So what's the timeline like as far as this and Urban Wrestling Alliance? Are these going at the same time, or are they?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. For the most part, I was doing both simultaneously. I was the lead announcer doing play-by-play and on-camera hosting for both FMW presented by Tokyo Pop and the Urban Wrestling Alliance at the same time, even though FMW lasted a little bit longer than the UWA did. So once the UWA stopped airing, I continued to do some more FMW wrestling. And by the way, I did audition for the Urban Wrestling Alliance as well for their syndicated TV show shown on UPN stations all across the country, including your UPN channel in New York.
UPN 54.
Yes.
So I feel like you were the perfect guy for that job, the Urban Wrestling Alliance job, because I just like the way you did it. And so what was it like working with, your partner on that was Rough Rider Cross. How was that?
Yes. Well, I'll tell you the process behind that. I auditioned for the Urban Wrestling Alliance, and after my first audition, which by the way, it got through my then talent agent at the time, my theatrical talent agent, John McCormick from the Morgan Agency in Hollywood. And after my first audition, I got the job as the lead announcer immediately. And at all of these auditions for the EWA, 2 main guys were there. Vic Bullock was one. Vic Bullock was the executive producer for the Urban Wrestling Alliance. And he's also been the executive producer for other TV shows, including the NAACP Awards and for the reality TV show Judge Mathis.
Oh, yeah.
And another guy who was at all the auditions was Tom Wang, who was our line producer for the UWA. And Tom Wang was the one who did a lot of communication with my talent agent at the time while I was on the set. And one thing I liked working with these guys and a lot of people with the UWA. Vic Bullock, he has experience as an executive producer for lots of TV projects. I respect that, and he was a good guy to work with. But at the same time, Vic respected my wrestling knowledge, and I gave him input, and he listened to it, and he acted upon at least some of my suggestions. For example, for the UWA, we brought on the wrestler Brent Albright, who is a good guy, a good family man, by the way, and a good talent. And he also wrestled as Gunner Scott on WWE SmackDown. And when Brent Albright was brought into the UWA, Vic told me he wanted to give him a different name. He wound up with the name Smoke, by the way. Brent Albright wrestled as Smoke in the UWA. But Vic told me, why don't we call Brent Albright Ravenous? I go, no, don't call Brent Albright Ravenous. And I told him why, because there was already an established wrestler named Raven, who at the time was wrestling for ECW, and before that he wrestled for WCW. And Raven was very well established as a wrestler, so you don't want to confuse Raven.
Fans would eat him alive. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, you don't want to confuse Raven, an established wrestler, with a name Ravenous. Wait, you get the two confused. So then they wound up with Smoke. And also at one of our first meetings for the UWA, I brought up a lot of these guys, they may be using established wrestling moves like the Death Valley Driver, the Northern Lights Bomb. Should we give them our own unique names? And Vic said, that is a very good point. So to give you one example of how, me talking about this came into play, as Marcus Ham mentioned, our head trainer was Michael Modest for the UWA. And also Michael Modest, he had some input when it came to like creative stuff as well. And at the time, for one match, I remember calling with Orlando Jordan in it. Orlando Jordan used a finisher, which was basically the Death Valley Driver. And Michael Modest told me, why don't we call it the Super Guillotine? And I go, okay. So then I called it the Super Guillotine. And I remember back in the day on one of the message boards, one of these marks, one of these keyboard warriors wrote, John Watanabe called it the Super Guillotine. It's called the Death Valley Driver. Well, and that shows that these wrestling fans, they know nothing about what goes on behind the scenes when it comes to putting on a wrestling product. They think they know everything, but they really don't.
Yep.
And I kind of agree with what the wrestling personality Taz once said. The internet community is not satisfied with anything, and that's an example of that.
Oh,
really.
yeah.
Some of them
They want to watch from afar and judge from afar without knowing what's going on.
Yeah, but some of the wrestling fans are more respectful though, and that's one reason why I especially like it when some of my peers give me good compliments, because they know the business, they know what wrestling is all about. So I'm thankful when people like Michael Modest and others have complimented my work. And I mentioned that at these auditions, another guy who was there was our line producer, Tom Wang, who again communicated with my talent agent. And one funny thing involving Tom Wang, he was our behind the scenes line producer. And I remember for our first UWA TV matches, we taped them at the venue known as the Barker Hangar in Santa Monica, California, which is where they've held the Nickelodeon Awards. And it's a nice venue, by the way. And we did our first set of matches, and we had a good size audience there. The arena was packed. And then there was an intermission. But then during the intermission, a lot of these fans walked out. Maybe some of them felt it was getting late, but I think some of these fans didn't know we had more matches that were filming. So because of that, after the intermission, we had a noticeably smaller crowd.
That happens so much. It happens in wrestling. It happens in comedy. You give people 15 minutes where nothing's happening, and sometimes they'll be like, well, I think I had a show. I think I saw enough show. I'm going to go now.
Right, but because of that, because for our next set of matches at the Barker Hangar in Santa Monica, there was a noticeably smaller crowd. So then some of our UWA crew members filled these seats, and one of them was our line producer, Tom Wang, as a regular fan in the audience while he was still wearing his UWA staff ID card around his neck. So it was funny to watch.
That's great.
So anyways, I passed the first audition. They hired me as the lead announcer. And after that first audition, I was then paired with different guys auditioning to be my color commentator. And, I auditioned with different guys calling different matches, showing on a video
Anybody
screen.
we might know?
No, Not to my knowledge, but
Yeah.
they wound up with Cross, aka Sean Martin Cross, who was a rapper from Rough Riders Entertainment. And on the topic of, people auditioning who are actors, when you did your interview recently with Marcus Ham talking about the UWA, you brought up the name Surge, who was an actor with no prior wrestling experience. He was an actor primarily. And I just want to say, first of all, that on a personal level, I really liked Surge a lot as a human being. He was a great guy. He was really like a gentle giant. He was this big man with a childlike spirit. And that came across in his on-air personality on the UWA TV shows. And that reminds me that some of the best gimmicks in wrestling are really extensions of who you really are. For example, when I did local ring announcing back in the day, one guy I had the honor of ring announcing was Dick Murdoch, Captain Redneck Dick Murdoch. And the guy you saw on camera or at the arena was the same guy you saw behind the scenes in person. Same guy, an extension of who he really was. And when Surge was on camera, he came across in the same way he was behind the scenes, a happy-go-lucky, very happy, joyful guy, good guy to be around. And he is an actor. His real name, for your information, is Sergio Risti.
Oh,
so that's
Surge.
got his wrestling. Yeah, Sergio, get it? Yeah. And when you look on his IMDb list of credits, Sergio Risti, among his acting credits, was being the voice of King Neptune for the cartoon show SpongeBob SquarePants.
Wow.
Yeah, and I can picture him doing the voice of a king because he had a rather authoritative, commanding voice and very articulate, and he did his promos well because he had that acting experience. And and also I should mention that Sergio Risti, or Surge, he also in recent years has been a motivational speaker for kids, and I could picture that because he had this childlike spirit, and I can picture him getting along with the kids. And he had always had this jovial countenance about him, very positive energy. So I could picture him being a motivational speaker for kids in particular. So I just thought I'd tell you that.
That's great.
I could picture some of the wrestlers frowning on Surge. Oh, this guy has no wrestling experience. Why is he getting a big push above us? Well, I think he had other qualities that made him stand out. He had a certain look, and he had acting experience.
Yeah, and there's an element of the TV show to the Urban Wrestling Alliance. It was a wrestling show, but it was also a TV show. So
yes,
he got there through that.
Yes, and a thing about the UWA, our TV shows, as Marcus Ham pointed out, their matches for TV were rehearsed over and over and over again as if they were rehearsing a stage play. Whereas wrestlers going back decades until maybe more recent times, the wrestlers could always call the match in the ring, beat by beat, improvisation. But the thing is, with modern day wrestling, with more and more Hollywood TV types and writers getting involved, that gives the wrestling itself less of a chance to breathe on its own and to create something on its own. You have more and more hands digging into the pot, Hollywood TV types, and they micromanage everything more and more, what the announcers say, what the wrestlers do in the ring. So that's why they had all these rehearsals. And the rehearsals for the UWA, by the way, they were held at this warehouse building in El Segundo, California, which is about 7 minutes away from LAX airport. And it's also the venue where UPW held classes and cards, and UPW back then was basically a feeder system for the World Wrestling Federation. And the wrestlers would rehearse these matches at this El Segundo warehouse with Michael Modest as the head trainer. Also, to give some other guys credit, they had two other assistant trainers. One of them was a guy named Soulman Alex G, who is well known for training MVP of WWE.
Oh, wow. Okay.
He was based on, Soulman G was based out of Florida. And another guy who did assistant training along with Michael Modest was Jimmy DeGiusti, who wrestled as Luminous for the Urban Wrestling Alliance, a big muscular guy. He was a part of a tag team with Bison Smith on the UWA TV shows. And Jimmy DeGiusti, along with being a good Christian man, by the way, he had a lot of experience going back to the territory days. He wrestled for the USWA in Tennessee and also for the Global Wrestling Federation in Dallas, Texas. So he had, good wrestling knowledge, and he passed it along to the younger guys in particular. Good. So these guys would rehearse the matches on the main floor at this El Segundo warehouse, and in this upper room at this same warehouse, they would have acting classes led by this Hollywood character actor named David Denard, he's done a lot of supporting roles, character actor roles.
I'm sure I would recognize him if I looked him up. Yeah.
Exactly. He's one of those character actors where if you saw him, you go, "Oh, that guy."
Yeah, that guy was in everything. Yeah.
Exactly. Right. So David Denard, he would do acting warm-ups with the wrestlers and do like scenes with the wrestlers. I know that one of the wrestlers hated these acting classes because he said he developed his own persona doing all these wrestling independent shows. And then when forced to do these acting classes, he was forced to be something he was not. So some of the boys did not like the acting classes, but I'm sure some of the guys did not mind them.
Yeah, some of them probably got something out of it.
Yeah, and I'm sure Surge being an actor, I'm sure he appreciated these acting classes. But also, I sat in on many of these rehearsals for these matches, and the boys really appreciated it. I mean, for one, Jimmy Snuka Jr., who wrestled for the UWA, he said, "Hey, I'm really glad you're here. It's all right." And I said, "Yeah, well, I'm thankful I'm here because I like to know what's going on so I know what to expect when the taping takes place. So I'm not just completely clueless out of the blue." So I appreciated watching these guys, and I learned a lot from watching Michael Modest and the other boys train the wrestlers. And when it came to Surge, he really had to be carried. He really had to be taught the basics when it came to wrestling. In particular, I saw Surge wrestle a practice match over and over again with Mayock, who was an experienced independent wrestler from Northern California, from All Pro Wrestling, where a lot of these UWA guys came from. Mm-hmm. It's the wrestling school that was shown in the movie Beyond the Mat.
One of my favorite movies.
Yeah, and some of the other UWA guys from the Urban Wrestling Alliance came from that school, like Mayock, Michael Modest, Bison Smith, the Shooter Tony Jones, and others. And when Michael Modest was training Surge with Mayock, Michael Modest kept on pointing at Mayock and told Surge, follow his lead. So Mayock really had to carry Surge and make Surge look good while getting squashed in the process. And Michael Modest, he complimented my announcing. Michael Modest told me, "You're doing a good job announcing, good job." And he also said one time, when it comes to Cross, his announcing is pretty good, even though his wrestling knowledge is zero.
Yeah.
But Cross was there for a different purpose, to cater to the hip hop people. But anyway.
Yeah, I thought you two played off each other pretty well.
Yeah, it was a fun time. And when the taping took place between Surge and Mayock, it was a really quick squash match where Surge totally squashed Mayock, really playing up Surge as this unstoppable monster. And I remember Michael Modest gave me some feedback when I did commentary for that match in particular, where during the match or at the end of the match, when Surge beat Mayock, I said, "Get out the ladle and scoop him off the mat. He's done." and Michael Modest said, "You could have been more empathetic or sympathetic by saying that Mayock put up a fight or something along those lines." I think it's partly because Modest early in his career, a lot of his high-profile matches was him as a jobber in the same role of losing to guys and making the bigger guys look good. And by the way, a quick shout-out to my good longtime friend, Sonny Rogers, one of the best TV jobbers ever. But anyway, Michael Braverman, who coached me behind the scenes on my play-by-play announcing work, Michael Braverman disagreed with Modest. Braverman said, "You simply call the fact the guy got his butt kicked." So, and I respect the feedback from both Modest and Braverman and other guys who really knew wrestling. And that's another thing. Behind the scenes, while the wrestlers were rehearsing their matches like stage plays over and over again in El Segundo, I was working behind the scenes a lot with Michael Braverman, who has a business partner, Barry Bloom, and Braverman and Bloom, they've managed or represented a lot of wrestling talent like Goldberg, like Kevin Nash, like Chris Jericho, and they started representing wrestling talent going all the way back to the mid 1980s, starting with Jesse the Body Ventura.
Yep, I was about to say, he's the first wrestler that got an agent, as far as I know.
Yeah, and I remember at a UWA TV taping, Barry Barry Bloom confirmed it with me. Barry said yes, he discovered Jesse Ventura while catching an episode of All American Wrestling on the USA Network, and the rest is history. And I respect Michael Braverman not only because he knew the wrestling business while some of the entertainment people did not, working on the UWA shows. Michael Braverman really devoted a lot of time to me and Cross. He dedicated time to us. I mentioned that because there were times when Braverman would give us coaching tips while we watched videos of wrestlers in action. And a couple of times, Barry Bloom would try to get a hold of Michael Braverman, and Braverman would say, I'm busy. I'm here trying to teach these guys something. And I respect that. Outside interference.
Sorry about that. Truth be told, I'm using the free version of Zoom, so it kicked me off after 40 minutes and I set it up 40 minutes ago, so it did that. So sorry, John.
That's okay. So I guess let's carry on with part 2, if you will.
Yes, when I put the video up, it's going to be like it didn't even happen.
Wow, oops. I better maintain kayfabe and pretend you weren't cut off. Okay, good.
So what do you think went wrong with the UWA? Why didn't it stick around? I watched it as a teenager. I loved it. What happened?
Well, thanks for watching. I'm thankful that you enjoyed the UWA while it lasted. Well, I don't know all the details, but in a nutshell, when it comes to operation of any wrestling promotion to be seen on TV, you need money. You really need a lot of money, which is why AEW, All Elite Wrestling, is so successful nowadays, because they have billionaires putting money into that operation, and they're doing well as well, so good for them. But you just need a lot of money put into this operation beyond just a backyard promotion in somebody's backyard to be seen on public access. You really need something when it comes to money, and also guys who know the wrestling business. And I think we had something good going because it had a different look, a different feel. And that's another positive thing about Cross, the Rough Rider, the rapper who did color commentary. One person pointed out he sounded different from other commentators you hear on a wrestling show. And that I agree with. So that was a plus.
Instead of a ring announcer, you had a DJ who brought people out. It was a whole different scene. I really liked it.
Well, I'm thankful that you did. Thank you.
So do you still keep up with wrestling? Do you still watch anything these days?
I still keep up with the wrestling business in general. I read daily news reports of what's going on behind the scenes in particular, just like, people read trade magazines for different industries. So I follow what's going on with the different organizations, both the major ones and the independents as well. So I keep in touch. I don't watch wrestling as intensely as you do nowadays with all these videos among your smorgasbord or potluck.
Yeah. Everything is out there now. It's so easy. It's the best time to be a wrestling fan. Everything is there. If you want to watch old stuff, you can just watch old stuff. If you want to watch stuff in Japan, it's right there. Lucha Libre. It's a lovely time to be a fan.
And you had pointed out that you've seen all the matches that are available on YouTube from the UWA Urban Wrestling Alliance.
Yes.
But there is one program we did, one episode we did of the UWA that is not on the internet as far as I could tell. And I personally thought it was our best program. It was shot in this studio setting on Melrose Avenue in the Hollywood area, where the whole show was me and Cross sitting on chairs, and it was like a recap show where we showed wrestling match highlights.
Oh, wow.
And we had sit down interviews with the different wrestlers with the UWA, like Brent Albright, Sonny Siaki, Orlando Jordan, and Marcus Ham. Also, who else do we have? Jimmy Snuka Jr., Jorge Estrada, and some of the actors who played characters on the show as well. And that was a good recap show to let the fans know what was going on, all the angles that were taking place, and match highlights of these guys doing their best in action. So
it seems like a perfect thing to get new fans into the show. If it was continuing, that would have been tremendous. My mission, and I said this to Marcus, and I'm saying it to you, I am trying to find every episode of the show, because I can't find any full episodes. All I'm watching are individual matches that are on YouTube. I am hunting down this show. I am going to find every episode of the Urban Wrestling Alliance, because it needs to be seen.
Well, sadly, well, at least there's the internet nowadays, and you get match highlights or some complete matches here and there. But sadly, this goes back to the wrestling territory days. A lot of wrestling promoters back in the old days did not save videotape of their TV shows or matches because they thought, oh, these are not going to be valuable.
Yeah.
Who cares? So a lot of times they just taped over them, over the videotapes, or they just threw them away. So that's one reason why there's just a scarcity of some stuff out there. And when it comes to our UWA TV shows, I'm just going to say this in a general sense for historical information purposes. I know of 2 production companies that were involved in our Urban Wrestling Alliance TV episodes. I don't know if they still have footage or complete shows. And even if they do have complete shows, they're not just going to give them to you or anyone for free.
Yeah.
I mean, and they're going to ask for something, and it's not going to be at paltry garage sale prices. Okay. So don't tell these guys, hey, John Watanabe told me you can just give me these shows just like that.
Yeah.
Okay, so
John sent me.
No, I didn't send you. Anyway, well, I know that 2 TV production companies involved with the Urban Wrestling Alliance were Rich Mel Productions. That's where we had some of our meetings, by the way, when it came to Michael Braverman coaching me and Cross on our announcing, and where even they had a staff of Hollywood scriptwriters there having meetings at Rich Mel Productions in Los Angeles. In fact, one time I overheard one of these meetings, and it was a female voice. I don't know who it was, but one of the staff writers who said, we should make Flatline the head star. And that goes to show you, I think a lot of people base pushes on wrestlers with how they look.
Yep.
And you know that Flatline, he was this big monster of a guy, really tall, really huge. So he was very intimidating looking. So I think that's one reason why some guys really wanted to push him, because of his look. But he was a real wrestler, as Marcus said. Those 2 go way back. And another thing about Flatline, his finishing move was the G-Shock, which was basically a form of a choke slam where you lift the guy by the throat and lift him up and throw him to the mat. And with some people, they think that the choke slam is just a regular move. It's nothing special. It's a transition move. But I agree with Michael Modest when Michael Modest said that Flatline does the choke slam extremely well. He made it very believable, not just because of how big and tall he was, but also he would do this, Flatline would do this bit where he would shake and quake his whole body before he did the choke slam.
Yeah, he made great faces.
Yeah, and it made it look like he was this giant volcano about to erupt. And then he finally did the choke slam, 1, 2, 3, and that made it an effective finisher. And that's, I think, where finishers become more effective, when a wrestler takes a basic move and makes it his own. And another example of that is back during the 1950s through the 1980s, there was a legendary wrestler, Reggie Lazowski, aka Da One, Da Only, Da Crusher, the wrestler who made Milwaukee famous. And his finishing move was the Crusher Bolo Punch. And normally you don't think of a punch as a finishing move, but when he did it, the Crusher would raise his fist in the air, yay! And then the crowd would cheer, knowing what was coming next. And then Crusher would wave his fist in the air like Popeye the Sailor Man, and then he would finally land the Crusher Bolo Punch. Boom, that was it.
That's
out.
Pro wrestling, man. I love it.
Yeah, and the fans loved it too. So Rich Mel Productions in Los Angeles, it's one of the production companies involved, and it was led by Rich Malcolm, who was a good man who I respect, and he worked with a lot of people over the years on various TV projects. And another production company involved with the UWA was Secret Headquarters, which handled post-production, which I worked a lot with. I did a lot of post-production for these UWA TV shows too, where I would be in a studio at different locations, and I would do looping or redoing of voiceover work to go along with the video editing of changes they made after our TV tapings. So I did a lot of post-production work as well for the EWA, and Secret Headquarters handled a lot of that. Last I heard, they were based on the west side of Los Angeles. I'm not so sure right now, but that was led by a man named Greg Hewson, who directed some of our episodes, but he mainly worked in post-production. Another good guy who I enjoyed working with. And I thought, if nothing else, I thought I'd give some of these guys some credit who worked hard behind the scenes, who did a lot of TV production and who I really enjoyed working with.
Well, let's start wrapping up. I'm gonna ask you this. I did a little bit of announcing with the House of Glory student shows, and let's just say I was not a John Watanabe. I was more of a Cross, and I wasn't very good at I didn't feel like I was good as a play-by-play guy. What advice would you give someone about doing play-by-play? My problem especially is that I didn't have confidence in the move names. You know what I mean? I would just not say anything because I didn't want to say the wrong thing. So what would you do if you don't know the name of a move but you want to put it over? Like what are little tricks and stuff like that?
Well, when it comes to the name of a move, well, why not create your own name for the move, a special name for it, especially if it's a finisher, to make it seem extra special, which is some of what we did with the UWA shows. And try to describe how it affects the other guy. Boy, he really landed hard on that side of his body, and that could really injure the guy. So how does it affect his opponent? And is this a way for the guy doing the move to earn his way to a victory? So try to put it over if it's a finishing move in that way, and try to explain how it affects the other guy in the process, and try to describe how the audience is reacting too, because a lot of improvisation feeds off of audience reactions. When you do things beat by beat, and when an audience laughs or screams, you can react to that reaction and feed off of that, and say something reacting off of that reaction as well.
Great, thank you. Hopefully I get another shot. Because I trained over at House of Glory for about a year. I'm no good in the ring. I'm not athletic, but I wanted to be a manager, so they thankfully found things for me all the time, and now I'm like ring announcing for them. But who knows? Maybe I'll get another shot at play-by-play.
Good. And another thing when it comes to play-by-play, as you know, I would do a lot of old school wrestling references where I would tell some of the history of the business. And that's a good thing, especially among younger or newer wrestling fans. You want to educate them about the wrestling business. And that's one bit of advice that my good friend Sonny Rogers gives. Sonny Rogers, he was a longtime wrestler, especially known as a TV jobber, but he was also a trainer and also a promoter of independence. And Sonny Rogers would say, do your homework when it comes to the history of the wrestling business, and also show respect for those who paved the way for you.
Yep.
Yes, absolutely. So this is the way I see it too. When it comes to learning about the history of the business, it gives me a greater perspective on what I see in today's wrestling. To me, it's like reading the Bible's Old Testament, which gives you a bigger picture of what takes place in the Bible's New Testament. So do your homework, and do your homework when it comes to the history of the business, because it will really help you a lot in the long term and give you a greater perspective of what's going on.
Awesome. Thank you. And so before we go, tell everybody what you're up to now. You're a broadcaster in California radio, so just you plug yourself. Let's
I'm thankful to God for all that I have had, including the wrestling announcing gigs for FMW and the Urban Wrestling Alliance. And before and after I did those wrestling gigs, I've worked in radio at different radio stations under different formats. Also, I've done my share of professional acting work on stage for stage plays, and also when it came to improvisation. And I've done my share of TV commercials too. In fact, not long after I did announcing for both of those wrestling leagues we've been talking about, I did this national TV commercial for the Charter Bundle, Charter Communications, a cable TV, phone, and internet service. I did a commercial for them. And on the message board for WrestlingClassics.com, which I used to, write here and there for, when I came to sharing my knowledge of wrestling. This one wrestling fan, I think his name is Jeff Brannon. He is from Atlanta, Georgia. He said, "Mr. Watanabe, I bought the Charter Bundle just because of you. You did a convincing job on that TV commercial for the Charter Bundle."
Well, now we got to find that commercial. If that commercial's on YouTube, it will be on the potluck next week.
No, I don't know about that. I don't know if it still exists, but nowadays I'm working on the air as an on-air personality at K-Wave, KWVE Christian Radio 107.9, heard throughout Southern California. And I've been there now for 12 years now, a dozen years, which is like eternity in radio, by the way. And also I'm heard on their sister Christian station, KSDW, heard in San Diego as well. And these stations are owned and on the campus, owned by and on the campus of Calvary Chapel, Costa Mesa, which was founded by the late, great Pastor Chuck Smith. And this weekend, a major motion picture is opening called Jesus Revolution, which in part tells the history behind Calvary Chapel, Costa Mesa, my employer, and the great Pastor Chuck Smith, who is played by Kelsey Grammer in this movie, Jesus Revolution. And from clips I've seen, Kelsey Grammer does a good job of playing Pastor Chuck Smith, and my wife April and I look forward to seeing it. And also, and I just thought I'd mention that when you listen to our Christian radio stations, where I act as a host or a presenter, introducing Christian teaching programs or in between Christian music sets, I act as the presenter, so to speak, on the air. But whether you hear me or anybody else on our stations, you're going to hear programming that will give you a much broader perspective of what's going on in this world around us, and also that will help you stay focused on what truly matters for all eternity. And also, I'm very proud of being a part of K-Wave. And also, I just recently started my own blog website, which is Straight Up Watanabe. Yeah, it's called straightupjohnwatanabe.blogspot.com. Again, I'll repeat it. It's straightupjohnwatanabe.blogspot.com, where I let people know where I am now, and I share my experiences in life in general. And also when it comes to sharing my experiences in the wrestling business for both the FMW and the UWA shows. And I'll keep on letting people know where I am, because over the years, ever since I left the UWA and the FMW wrestling shows, wrestling fans from all over the place have contacted different broadcasting stations I've worked at, saying, discovering that I'm there, oh, this is where you're at now. So instead of wrestling fans calling up receptionists, saying, is John Watanabe there? This is a way. Yeah, this is a way for fans to keep in touch of where I am, what I'm doing now, and I'll share my memories about wrestling, about where I've worked in wrestling, and about the wrestling business in general.
Excellent. Again, I'm going to put a link. I'm going to put that link in the description of the YouTube video when it goes out. So good. Awesome. Thank you so much. Straight Up John Watanabe. Really appreciate you making time to be on the potluck. Hope you have a great weekend.
Well, I hope you do too. And I'm so thankful after my wife April and I did our daily Bible devotional readings. I'm thankful that you fed me in a different way by serving up delicious delicacies from Pro Wrestling on Pro Wrestling Potluck. Keep up the good work. God bless you.
All right. Have a good night. Thank you so much again. And see you soon. I'm going to find the episodes and I'm going to send them all to you.
Thank you. Shalom, shalom.
All right. Thank you. Good night.
Good night.